Here's a real gem of an article. I've been doing some research into the rise of the banking houses in Venice and Genoa, from the rise, the beginnings, the roots of the Serenissima Venetian Republic. And, I discovered that the hegemony wielded by the Venetian Republic was really enabled by their success in propagating the Crusades, which were, as this article shows, fraudulent in nature and amounted to kind of major extortion rackets, looting, threats, corporate violence, and that I saw such a strong, it was like an aha moment. I could see such strong parallels. I could see, not parallel lines, one line. I could see one line going from what we've seen in the modern age, a kind of militaristic corporatism that uses jingoistic propaganda to whip people up and support entirely fraudulent causes and to kill and die for them. And I think if you look at the Venetians going back to this time, that they were able to cash in a major way when they finally, the sack of Constantinople brought in so much loot and wealth. Europe had never seen such an infusion of treasure. And it was on the basis of this that they began to wield enormous power economically over the continent, and resulting in the bankrupting most European economies. And, they must have learned their lesson, because they discovered, really, in essence, the Venetian method is divide and conquer using, fomenting religious conflict, which they learned from their experience in whipping people up with religious dogma to do the dirty work of the Crusades. Then they employed the same tactic later in the wake, or roughly at the same time, the War of the League of Cambrai, when most of Europe came together in the League of Cambrai and decided to attack Venice and snuff it out once and for all, because everyone had suffered terribly from the kind of economic hitman tactics. So, as in response to this, the Venetians created the Reformation by first of all discovering Martin Luther, supporting him, promoting him, and whipping up a religious conflict that would last for several centuries, while the countries that had worried Venice so much that Venice was afraid that they would be attacked from the north. Now the north is caught up in religious warfare. Let's see, where else you see this tactic being carried out, where then they also ran the Counter-Reformation, the Venetians, and you see how it's happening today. And if you connect the dots and you do the research, you can see that in many cases it's the same noble families, the same tactics, the same justifications, the same corporate fascist methodology of deception and intimidation and terrorism, which I would describe what is the fundamental defining feature of terrorism, and I would describe that to the Anglo-American terrorism of the twin powers of military might and the centers of economic speculation in the City of London and on Wall Street. It's just astonishing to read this and to see that nothing has really changed. When they've got the world whipped up Remember, in the wake of 9/11, they said, "Oh, this is a clash of civilizations, war of civilizations." They tried to get it whipped up then. Didn't quite go over the way they had wanted, but they're going to try it again. And let's get into this. This is tremendously eye-opening. Today's Neo-Feudalism and the Crusades by Gerald Rose, wonderful scholar from 2006. As the October 9th, 2004 conference at Middlebury College on the privatization of national security, sponsored by Felix Rohatyn and George Shultz, Professor Peter Fever of Duke University said, "In fact, what we are seeing is a return to neo-feudalism. If you think about how the East India Company played a role in the rise of the British Empire, there are similar parallels to the rise of the American quasi-empire," unquote. This was not an imprecise use of language when Fever called the privatization of the military neo-feudalism. It is one of those anomalies which seems minuscule but gives away the show. As a system, feudalism was more than the use of the majority of the human population as chattel attached to the landed titled nobility. Fever was referring to the fact that under feudalism there were no nation-states. Private armies, chartered as supranational corporations or quasi-religious orders, roamed Jerusalem, Spain, southern France, and Constantinople to impose an ideology and a system of looting upon its victims. Fever was not criticizing this, he was praising it as a new model. Fever's reference to the British East India Company as feudal was more precise than he perhaps imagined. As documented in Executive Intelligence Review, March 31st, 2006, the British East India Company had a larger standing army than that of the National British Army. The East India Company is a feudal form of organization chartered by supranational authorities. In the case of the British East India Company, it was a crown charter with its own army and its own charter to govern beyond the reach of any national authority. There's no way to understand feudalism except as a dynamic system whose main animating force was the Crusades. To be clear, feudalism was not a sociological phenomenon. It was a system maintained by the Crusades. In principle, the Crusades were used to crush the rise of secular government that led to nation-states. Through this dynamic, the feudal system imposed an ultramontane, universal dictatorship on behalf of the black nobility led by Venice. This is the technical meaning of corporatism, in which the state is subordinated to financial interests that rule above the state. Although some consider it impolite to mention this, feudalism is where fascism comes from. When Rohatyn recently burst out with the idea that Franklin Roosevelt did not go to supranational banks to borrow money for basic infrastructure in the 1930s, he was referencing Mussolini and his feudal corporatist state. As we will document, this system is an exact repeat of the developments in which the black nobility, dominated by Venetian banking circles, chartered all corporations and gave them the franchise to loot. This is the explicit model advocated by today's Siena Group under the direction of economist Robert Mundell. It goes by the name of globalization. It is only a lack of historical insight as to where the system has led that allows Fever to get away with this fraud. The system Rohatyn and Fever are referring to ended in the bankruptcy of the world banking system and the Black Plague, which wiped out 1/3 or more of the population, not only of Europe, but also of Asia. What really were the Crusades? Not surprisingly, there is an attempt in the United States to romanticize the Crusades, particularly the crusading orders such as the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaler, around the cult novel The Da Vinci Code. If one wants to rid oneself of such delusions, read some of the greatest works of literature by Rabelais, Cervantes, and Shakespeare, who were disgusted by the utter ecstatic insanity of the crusading knights, who wrecked all good order and government in the medieval period. The irony that these crusades were allegedly doing it for Christ was such anathema to real Christians like Shakespeare, Cervantes, and the most pens and minds were inspired to produce the greatest pieces of humor in history. The initial crusade was preached in 1095 by Pope Urban II. At the council arose to liberate Jerusalem and the sepulchre of Christ from the infidels. It was preached in the open air before a crowd of thousands from the French countryside, who had been organized for a full year by a combination of tours by Pope Urban II and Peter the Hermit, a populist ranter. There were a good number of nobles there, along with the peasants. All those who would go to the Holy Land to liberate it were promised that they would be exempt, not only from any sin carried out in the commission of that liberation war, but also from any sin that they had ever committed. This doctrine later became the practice that with money you could buy such dispensations, which were called indulgences. Two things should be emphasized. First, Urban II, before becoming the Pope, was the prior at the Benedictine Abbey at Cluny, which was a cult center inside the church. Second, he was a retainer of Matilda of Tuscany, who, along with Hildebrand, who became Pope Gregory VII, created a faction of ruling elites called the Black Guelph. It was this tendency that waged war against the nation-building of Charlemagne and the Hohenstaufen. These two houses were the Holy Roman Emperors, who opposed the proven forgery of the donation of Constantine. This forgery, which was discovered in the 8th century, was a supposed 4th century document written by Constantine himself, in which he supposedly recognized that the highest temporal authority was the papacy, and that kings were only appendages of the papacy. This is what is known as the ultramontane rule of the Church. During the Council of Florence, Lorenzo Valla proved that the donation of Constantine was a forgery with documents provided by the Eastern Orthodox Church, which participated in the council. This ultramontane doctrine was imposed by the Crusades. The actual policy articulated by the Pope was a radical break with the previous Augustinian concept of the just war. In this latter view, although an individual Christian was called upon to turn the other cheek, and under no circumstances to kill his neighbor, there were situations such as when tens of thousands of people were under attack, when Christians should defend themselves with armed might. The only circumstance under which this may be done was for defense. Such acts must not be taken out of revenge or desire for territorial advantage or to loot the resources of another country. The only goal of such a war was to impose a just peace, not only for oneself, but for those whom one had to fight. Also, there had to be some chance of one winning such a fight. This concept was defined in the very beautiful terms by Rabelais in the first paragraph of Gargantua's address to the vanquished. Rabelais identifies this idea of a just peace. Quote, "Our fathers and grandfathers and ancestors from time immemorial have been of such a nature and disposition that as a memorial to the victories and triumphs they have won in battles they have fought, they have preferred to erect monuments in the hearts of the vanquished by a display of clemency than to raise trophies in the form of architecture in the land they have conquered. For they have valued the lively gratitude of men, won by their liberality, more highly than mute inscriptions on arches, columns, and pyramids, which are subject to the injuries of climate and all men's spite." Unquote. Gargantua then elaborates on the clemency and generous treatment extended to barbarians who had pillaged, depopulated, and sacked regions of the state, or practiced piracy, or who simply were defeated in fair naval battle. This is just the opposite of the attitude of the Crusades. Fraud. The entire religious justification of the Crusades to liberate the Holy Land was a fraud. The tip-off was that the first act of the Crusaders, even before they got to the Holy Land, was to set off a series of pogroms against the Jews of Europe, to steal their property and to pay for part of the Crusades, and to kill a large number of Jews, just to get in the right spirit before the Crusades got to the Holy Land. These pogroms were to last centuries, and the arguments for the Crusades were the justification for hardcore anti-Semitism. That is why it was so ironic that the neocon Israeli Bibi Netanyahu preached such a crusade against the Muslims in front of the America-Israel Public Affairs Committee in Washington, D.C. recently. That meeting of AIPAC, addressed by Vice President Dick Cheney and Netanyahu, was pretty much a Mad Hatter's ball. Also, the idea that the Crusades were liberating Jerusalem from the Muslims, or that this had anything to do with religion, was exposed by the reality that most of the Crusades had nothing to do with the Holy Land. There were Crusades in Spain against the Moorish and Jewish populations. There were Crusades against heretics in southern France, the Albigensian Crusade. But the crusade that gave the show away was the Fourth Crusade against Constantinople, which was the largest Christian city in the world at the time. The Fourth Crusade, Venice's role. It was during the Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 1204, that Venice consolidated its power internationally. Venice was the banker for the papacy and the key beneficiary of the Crusades. In the breakup of the Roman Empire into the Western Empire, whose seat was in Rome, and the Eastern Empire, whose seat was in Constantinople, the Roman side of the empire was being overrun by pagan tribes. So, some of the Roman nobility took their money and retainers and escaped to the lagoons of Venice, a location that was indefensible because it was approachable only by water. From there, they established the largest banking empire in history. This empire, still intact today, created the International Synarchy Organization, as EIR has documented in many locations. How did Venice consolidate such enormous power? It did it through the Crusades. If you look at the logistics of the Crusades to the Holy Land from Europe, there are only two routes available. One was over land, by way of Constantinople, and the other was by sea, by way of Venice. Venice had built up, for the purpose of mercantile looting and defense, the largest fleet in the world. Its shipyard, called the Arsenal, was by far the largest in Europe. While preparing for the Fourth Crusade, it had 19,000 full-time workers. In this Fourth Crusade, the Venetians led the Norman chivalry to attack Constantinople. So this crusade had nothing to do with Muslims, Jews, or religion. It was an attack on a Christian city, which was looted and burned to the ground. Of course, they roped in the Norman chivalry by telling them, we're going to liberate Jerusalem. But the Norman knights, when they were assembled, realized that they had fallen short in terms of raising the requisite funding. And so the Venetians stepped in. I think it was Enrico Dandolo, who was the Doge of Venice. A very crafty gentleman. It's rumored, I think he was the blind Doge, but there was some question as to whether he was actually blind or not. And he said, well, we'll lend you the money, we'll go through with this, we'll float the loan to you, but in return, on the way there, we're going to have to, if you would help us, please, in exchange for us bailing you out, subduing the city of Zara that has been causing us some problems, and then we'll continue. And the knights were like, oh yes, not a problem. So they did that, and then on the way, Constantinople for an orgy of looting and murder and burning and all the rest of it. The Venetians started the Fourth Crusade by convincing everyone that they were going to attack Egypt. Excuse me, I got that wrong. So everyone piled into boats, and the Doge of Venice, Dandolo, guided the ships toward Constantinople using a very flimsy pretext to attack the city. Constantinople had 400,000 people. Venice, which had only 60,000, was the third or fourth largest city in the world, and I wouldn't call it Christian either. In the course of the Fourth Crusade, Venice and the Norman nobles killed several thousand Christians and took everything that was movable to Venice. The two famous lions that stand in front of the largest church in Venice, St. Mark's, were stolen from Constantinople. And the top of St. Mark's Church in Venice has Byzantine domes, which were stolen from Constantinople. The Norman knights who ran the operation and the French kings and others owed 85,000 gold florins to Venice, which is an enormous amount of money. And so Venice bankrupted both the knights who fought the crusade and the countries that funded the knights who fought the crusades. The English kings, French kings, Sicilian kings, and others. And, this was probably, this amounted to an economic form of warfare that would prevent the emergence of nation states. Through this crusade, Venice established the Venetian Empire. The Crusades consolidated the power of Venice by crushing all the potential nation states. It was simply a pretext to get rid of these states. Any king who would not send his knights and vassals to fight had a crusade preached by the Pope against him. This is referenced by Shakespeare in King John. The Benedictine-run papacy was an internal policing apparatus, using the church to loot all the peasants, all the knights, and all the kings to fund the Crusades. This process was set in motion because until the Crusades, there were very strong city-building tendencies which were referenced by the alliance in the east, by Harun al-Rashid and the Baghdad Caliphates, and in the west by Charlemagne. These tendencies, like those of Abbe Suger and Abelard in the great cathedral construction movement in France, which was continued by the Hohenstaufen Holy Roman Emperors, represented a mortal threat to the Venetian interests. For the idea of the city builders was to develop the populations of Europe. You see, they're still fighting against that today. And look at what's happening in Africa. Africa is so hip to this, and they're actually succeeding in resisting and throwing out the in a sense, multinational forces because they're corporatist by nature, and it's the kind of corporate imperialism that we're looking at here, going back to the time of the Crusades. And Africa is throwing out the French, is throwing out the British, throwing out the Americans, throwing out the IMF, and they want to develop. And they're quite right in seeing very clearly that the path to development for them was shut down by these predatory economic policies. Anyway, let's go on. As Dante Alighieri points out in both De Monarchia and De Vulgari Eloquentia, secular governments and a literate language in the vernacular, not Latin, along with a common history, define a people. To have a people speaking a literate language, Dante said, was the fundamental question in governing human beings. Excuse me. This tendency was the exact opposite of the donation of Constantine ultramontane Venetian papacy faction. The Crusades wiped out the tendency toward nation-states until it emerged again in the wake of the 15th century Italian Renaissance. The untold story. The most devastating aspect of this Fourth Crusade was that Venice consolidated control of all the trade routes with the East. The work done by Paul Gallagher's Publielio magazine, winter 1995, points out the most devastating irony. Do you know who became the Venetian allies after the Fourth Crusade? The Mongol Empire, led by the infamous Khans. Of course, I'm living in Mongolia now. This kind of, I chafe at reading this because there's a whole aspect to the Mongolian culture and to the Mongolian Empire that's ignored, that the West cannot see. At least back 2006, nobody was aware that there was a positive side to the Mongol Empire, and that Genghis Khan was not at all the kind of monster that's portrayed in the school book agenda. So anyway, ignoring that, or putting it aside for now, the Mongols were the fascist policing apparatus of the entire East. So you have a clash of cultures here. From the Western point of view, it looks like fascism because they're being exploited and used as the bleeding edge of an operation that's essentially corporatist, fascist, feudalist, right? But from a completely, I've lived here in Mongolia for 10 years, and let me tell you, it's a completely different cultural psychology, and you kind of look at it from the other side, and it looks different, So, they worked with Venice to loot China, to loot the Caucasus, to loot Kiev, and to loot the Holy Land. Venice was able to consolidate its trade with this Han dynasty in the wake of the Fourth Crusade. What Gallagher develops is a very important historic insight into how, by the manipulation of the money supply of gold and silver by the Venetian banking houses, in coordination with the control of the eastern production of gold by the Mongol Khans, the Venetians created a monopoly of both precious metals. By the Mongols selling gold at a certain price to Venice, and Venice's replacement by silver currency in Europe of the previous gold currency, Venice locked up the market in gold and forced debt contracted by the Western kings in silver to be repaid in gold. They also set the price for the gold-silver ratio. The rates of return on the Venetian gold were so great that they bankrupted every kingdom in Europe and detonated mid-14th century the bankruptcy of the famous Bardi Peruzzi Bank. That was actually a Florentine bank. This currency looting caused a worldwide banking crisis, and as a direct result of the physical looting of the East by the Mongols and the Venetians looting Europe, it left Europe and Asia vulnerable to the spread of the Black Death. Full cycle. So although it seemed a minor point in Fever's talk, the question of feudalism is not some historical curiosity. In a recent discussion, Lyndon LaRouche commented that, as we see in EIR's recent work on the black nobility, Michael Ledeen and Robert Mundell, today's situation is not only analogous to feudalism, but the same nobility families that imposed feudalism on the nascent potentials for nation states in the period of the Crusades are today attempting to impose such a feudal fascist order on the United States. First of all, I apologize. When I would go off on my little tangents, I would end up repeating things that were in the article just around the corner, and I apologize, but I just get so excited about this stuff. I hope I was able to, supplement just a little bit. If nothing else, maybe you hear the excitement in my voice, or perhaps something is ringing bells for you. And I encourage everyone to follow up on this history and the lessons that we should learn. Clearly, the end of this, where it says at the very last sentence, attempting to impose such a feudal fascist order on the United States, I would say that's happened. So this is 2006, but Gerald Rose is astute enough to notice, I would argue that it has happened. We do live under a feudal fascist order in the United States, and there doesn't seem to be a way out of it at this point. I hate to say that. I know that many people might accuse me of being being a black pill dispenser. There are many ways for the human race to develop. I just don't have much hope that there's a way out of this for the United States. We're seeing a new paradigm emerging in the BRICS, and there's no mention of that here, but definitely this is offering something. This is one, the BRICS are probably, this is the primary reason that the Africans are now able to get out from under the yoke of Western imperialism, because the Russians and the Chinese are offering them something quite different, something more along the lines of nation building, something more along the lines of the Hohenstaufen, which is really quite interesting. These two epistemological viewpoints at constant, maybe eternal conflict with one another, taking place in a very big way now in the world as never before. And it's a fascinating time to be alive. Anyway, let's keep our eyes open.